Hello ladies and gents, I'm the Dapper Rat, and this is the second part of a 4-part upload, so be sure to check out the previous parts to gain a better understanding of what's going on. However, for those of you with little time, here's a summary. Essentially, I'm clarifying my ideas to balance heroes by putting them in roles that give them access to certain properties. These string of videos go over where each property belongs, their strength in order to monitor how often it's used, and in part 4 we're going to balance a couple that are generally terrible for the game. That being said, let's resume where we left off. Moving on, we have Bleed. Everybody seems to hate Bleed. It does non-permanent damage to an opponent, causing their health to tick away slowly, and getting healed by any amount from any source will immediately remove all bleed from your hero. So this allows bleed-based moves to dish out more damage than what is usually allowed. That being said, in a gank, bleed is great and there is a reason for that. Your attacks don't do as much damage, so they feed less revenge. However, you're forgetting that extra bleed on top of it, which means that you're doing more damage for less revenge. And then there's the added bonus on top of that where if somehow the person you're fighting gets revenge anyways, you can still attack their health bar because bleeding ignores the shield that they get. Moving on to team fights, you are doing generally speaking more damage than a regular team, but at the same time it's not a huge deal, and if they just keep their composure it's not really gonna affect them all that much. Moving on to duels, basically the same thing. Your time to kill might actually be a little bit lower than a base character because if your bleed was flat damage, you might be able to kill people way faster. However, in an anti-gank, that hurts tremendously. Stacking bleed on people in an anti-gank is horrific because that damage is not confirmed, which means you're going to be in that anti-gank for way longer than you would like to be, which means you're way more often going to die in an anti-gank because you can't kill people fast enough. This earns Bleed a spot in the gankers category. It doesn't make sense anywhere else because its only real benefit comes from ganking. Now then, moving on to counters, a property completely unique to Black Prior, and thank God it is because this property bothers me. So what counters do is it is essentially a catch-all move. With this property, doesn't matter if they have hyper armor, doesn't matter if it's unblockable, doesn't matter if it's a bash, they can counter you, and it works like All Guard in a similar way where they counter you and they get a confirmed hit off of it. Now then, the other additive benefit of this is if multiple people are attacking you and they hit you within a certain window of using it, you just restart the animation and counter them as well anyways. Now, it does have a single weakness, just one, and that weakness is guard breaks. This basically means that your counter is a stronger version as All Guard because it has the same benefits with none of the weaknesses, which basically means you can stick near the person, get a guaranteed hit off, and it doesn't matter what they're using to attack your teammate. Under perfect conditions, it's basically impossible to win a gank against this guy. In a team fight, it's still very, very strong because, as I explained before, or as you failed to explain because you went on another rant for no reason, in a team fight, essentially, neither one of your opponents can really attack you because if you counter them, then they can't stop any of the damage. Only your teammate can interrupt you, so a patient teammate will be able to capitalize on your counter, and even if you end up getting guard broken, your teammate is still there to bail you out by just interrupting the enemy and letting you recover, so there's really no risk involved even in a team fight. Because of this puts counters as the only central property. Continuing, next is Deflects, which are high risk, low reward move that is extremely flashy and feels amazing to do. Basically, just dodging into an opponent's regular attack initiates your deflect, allowing you to hit them and gain offensive control, just as a parry would. Now in a gank, deflects have no use because if your opponent is not locked onto you, you can't use it, and if they are locked onto you, it has a tiny bit of use as it does stun your opponent for a small amount of time, but this window is so small that it's just negligent. In team fights, deflects are actually kind of at their best because you can easily hit deflect after deflect if your opponents aren't careful. Now moving into a duel, deflect loses its viability, just becoming an alternative to a parry. However, the hit of dopamine alone from landing a deflect, I think makes it viable enough for me. Overall, there isn't really a downside to using a deflect in a duel, and there's not really an upside either. Now in an anti-gank, it is actively a detriment because it works as a parry without the extra defense from chain parries. So I'm currently editing this and I wanted to double check if this was actually true because I remember chain deflects kind of being a thing. So after testing over and over again, I found out that yes, they are a thing. However, their window is smaller than chaining parries together. They're much less reliable, and so just overall they are a worse version of the parry. However, you can chain deflects together as is right now. Monitoring these, we can see that deflect has its home in team fights. However, due to the deflect's low impact, even in team fights, it's completely okay to put it as a duelist property. Moving on, we have enhanced lights, a property that stops your attacks from being fully blocked, stopping your damage as usual but not interrupting your chain. Enhanced lights roughly have the same viability in all categories, as being able to fight using your light attacks with less of a disadvantage is huge. Enhanced lights apply a non-threatening pressure where it is up to the victim to decide how dangerous it is. Essentially, when being attacked by someone with an enhanced light, the light itself is not the threat, but the chain that comes after it is. So each individual has to decide their personal ability to deal with a hero's chain. So overall, this is gonna land in the duelist category. I'm fine with everybody having this. Next is Knockdown. As the name implies, it knocks you to the floor. It is extremely powerful for ganks, as leaving your opponent completely helpless like a little child is extraordinarily strong. In the case of a team fight, its strength falters a bit because your opponent's teammate can defend him while he's out cold, but is usually viable enough to use successfully, and so it's not that big of a deal. Moving to duels, Knockdown basically is a non-factor. It's still completely viable, especially because oftentimes you are given a guaranteed attack after this. Now in anti-ganks, it really depends. For some heroes, it can be viable for displacement or even just taking someone out of the fight for a little, or for actual use to do damage. Now that being said, its usefulness in an anti-gank is heavily reliant on other factors like the distance and the stacked properties, or even the hitbox range. Everybody remembers old Valkyrie's sweep. It doesn't matter if you're a teammate or foe, you are all sitting your ass on the ground. This nets Knockdown into the ganker category. And so with that, we can bring part 2 to a close. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Should certain properties be placed elsewhere and why? That being said, farewell ladies and gents.